Good afternoon and welcome to this month's Self-Build Hour. I'm your host, Jenny Chandela, and you are going to be learning all about the Scottish planning system today. As a reminder, the Self-Build Hour was developed so people could learn about all those wonderful self-build topics in depth, hearing directly from an expert on a monthly basis. So every month, we choose a topic to deep dive into, and then we invite an expert to present on that. And those of you who are attending live today have the opportunity to ask questions directly to the presenter. So there is a Q&A function that you can type your questions into directly. If you don't have that Q&A function, that's absolutely fine. Just use the chat function. We are recording today, so you'll be able to go back and revisit this information later. We've got a wonderful library of past topics that we've delved into, so do feel free to go back into that part of the website and look at those past topics that you may have missed or you may wish to refresh your information on. So I'm sitting here at NSBRC today. I have a slightly different background than typical because it is a hive of activity today as we are preparing, or the centre are preparing for their show tomorrow. So as a result, I decided to sneak away into a small meeting room to be a little bit quieter. So that's why you'll notice the background. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce Alan. He's going to be today's speaker. This is a follow-on topic from last month. Last month, we talked about the English planning system. This month, we'll be talking about the Scottish planning system. Alan Farningham comes to us from Farningham Planning. He has over 30 years of experience dealing with planning policy and legislation within the Scottish system. He comes with a background of having worked with the local authorities as a planning officer there. So he's got that really unique perspective of understanding how the local authorities work, but he now runs his own consultancy and he helps clients through planning applications, appeals, and probably anything in between before and after. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Alan. Thank you for joining us.
Hi. As Jenny said, my name's Alan Farningham. I'm a planning consultant. I've actually been doing planning a bit longer than Jenny was suggesting, hence my lack of hair. It's been over 40 years now. I first started off as a planning officer in Fife, and then I worked with a number of authorities, moved into house building with Barrett's and Stuart Milne. And then for the last 20 odd years, I've been a planning consultant. So in terms of types of planning permission, there's a whole multitude of permissions and consents that most of you will be aware of. Scheduled monument consent. We have the Section 36 and Section 37 consents, which I would think you're probably not interested in. That tends to be for wind turbines and wind energy developments of a certain scale. Advertisement consent, listed building, conservation consents, and there are also certificates of lawful use and development, which are very, very specific. And equally, we have Section 42 applications, Section 42 of the Planning Act, whereby you would look to vary or remove a planning condition attached to an extant planning permission. What I'd like to focus on today is planning permission in principle, matters specified in conditions, which are MSC applications, which are usually a follow-on to applications where planning permission in principle has been granted, and then planning permission or full permission as is known. Now, there's a hierarchy of development within Scotland. There are three categories: local, major, and national. National development is for usually major infrastructure developments, and I would think it's unlikely that anyone on the call here today would be terribly interested in that. We have major applications, which in terms of housing is for developments of 50 units or more, or for sites that are 2 hectares or more. And then probably the last category is the local, which is what I'd look to focus on today, given that my understanding is that the majority of people on the call today would be promoting things such as house extensions, conversions, and also self-build plots. So in terms of planning permission in principle, I would always suggest that if you're going for a single plot or a number of plots that are not allocated specifically in a local development plan, that you would apply for a planning permission in principle, which looks to establish the principle of development before, or as an alternative to going for full planning permission, which is a detailed application, because my view would be, and certainly this is my experience, that unless the principle has been established, if you go in with a full application with full detail, you've gone to the expense first and foremost of that detail, and there's no guarantee that the principle has been established. So I would, if a site's allocated in a local development plan, that's different, because it would mean that the principle of that housing development has already been established on the basis of that allocation, and it would be reasonable to go straight forward to full planning permission. But the permission in principle is the route if there's no allocation available to you. In terms of extensions and conversions, very, very different. You would normally go for detailed or full planning permissions for each of these categories. Extensions are very detailed by nature, and the principle of extending a property in planning policy terms would be acceptable in principle, and equally converting buildings to residential, particularly buildings that no longer have an active use, and you're bringing them back into something that would be fit for purpose. Again, generally speaking, the principle of securing permission for that is already established in policy, and also planning authorities would always want to see the detail of exactly what you are converting the building to by way of materials, design, and external elevations. There is an element of pre-application public consultation, but that's generally for large applications, whether they're major or national. You would not normally require pre-application public consultation for local developments, albeit that depending on the scale of what you're proposing, and also understanding perhaps what the local politics are, it would be sometimes worthwhile having some form of engagement with the local community. In terms of pre-application public consultation, when if you do have to go down that route on these larger applications, there's a requirement to go through 2 consultation events, and then also prepare a pre-application public consultation report, which is a requirement of validation. But again, in terms of smaller local type developments, extensions, conversions, single plots or 2 or 3 plots, you're not required to go through that process. In terms of preparing your planning application, there is a process of going through pre planning application discussions with the planning authority. Each planning authority in Scotland has a different way of dealing with that. Some charge, some don't. If you are clear on the principle of the development that you're promoting, I would say that going down a pre-planning application route is really not worth it, and it's certainly not worth paying for. It would only be if there are policy issues of principle that you'd want to get some indication from the planning authority if that was worthwhile doing. On the basis that the principle was not an issue and you were simply just coming forward with detail that was about design, as you're probably all aware, design's very, very subjective. So ultimately, the best way of dealing with that is through discussions and negotiations during the planning application process, as opposed to seeking a view at the pre-application stage, which has a tendency to be heavily caveated and not terribly helpful in terms of going forward. The level of supporting information that you would need for local development can vary depending on what you're actually applying for, and also depending on where the proposal is. There's one interesting change in terms of recent years with the introduction of the National Planning Framework document, National Planning Framework 4, which forms part of the development plan along with the local development plan and supplementary guidance, which are the policies against which any proposal is determined, whereby there's a policy, NPF 4 Policy 3 on biodiversity, which requires a biodiversity compliance statement to be submitted with applications, even for single houses, not for extensions, but conversions, whereby you need to demonstrate that through the development, there will be an uplift in biodiversity, and that can be done through planting of trees, landscaping, shrubs, bird boxes, a whole host of things like hedgehog houses, boxes, that would meet all the requirements. And each planning authority has a biodiversity list against which your application would be assessed. So it's important to be aware of that going forward. Also important that if you're doing conversion of buildings where there may be potentially bats, you would require to do a bat survey, and it's important that the timing of that survey is done correctly, because it can only be done at certain times of the year. As far as bats are concerned, that would be end of March to the end of September. And if you don't do it within that time frame, you can't do it during the winter time. So there's therefore delay on your application. So if you are doing conversion work, particularly with old agricultural buildings, you would be well advised to get an ecology consultant on board early in order to establish whether this is something that would be required. And if it is required, it's something that you would want to get done timely during that period. Otherwise, you're going to end up with up to 6 months delay in terms of getting an application determined, because planning authorities are prevented from putting a condition on a planning permission for a bat survey. The bat survey work has to be done and assessed in advance of any decision. In pulling together your planning application and in terms of supporting information, I've touched on ecology, I've touched on the sort of biodiversity. You would also probably require a design statement. Again, most authorities don't have a different view. Some will ask for it, some won't. But I think it's always helpful, particularly when you're going forward with extensions, maybe less so an extension, but more conversions of properties to residential or new build single plots, that you would want to explain the approach to the design that you've arrived at. And in that respect, I would suggest that you get advice from your project architect, who will be well versed in producing these statements. They're not huge. They could be a single A4 page or two A4 pages, but it's really just to give the planning officer and the authority an idea of the approach that you've taken in arriving at the design that you're presenting as part of your proposal. In terms of most applications for extensions wouldn't require any form of planning policy statement to support your application, but I would always suggest that where you're going for a single plot or a number of plots on land that's not allocated, and there's a policy principle to be established, or if you're looking to convert an old building, whether it be a listed building or an agricultural building, redundant agricultural building to residential, I would always suggest that you get a supporting planning statement, because there will be very specific planning policies against which these applications will be determined. And in getting that planning statement done, it is something that can be done by the applicant, or it can be done by an architect. As a planning consultant, I would obviously suggest that you get a planning consultant on board to do that statement, because they would be best placed to understand the planning policy and how best to interpret that in presenting your case as strongly and robustly as possible. And just in that, anyone can read policies in a local development plan or within the national planning policy framework. Certainly from my experience, the big mistake that people tend to make is that they read the policy and they take out of the policy what they want to take out of it, without necessarily understanding fully what the policy's actually trying to achieve. So when you're looking at planning policies, it's always important in interpreting those policies and applying them to your proposal in support, that you read the pretext and you also read the subtext, because that will set out the purpose and objectives of the policy. And you really need to understand the purpose and objectives of the policy in order to be able to determine it correctly. So that would be something whereby I think that, again, not for house extensions, but certain conversions and single plots, where I think it would be well worthwhile engaging with a planning consultant early on. In terms of once your application is in the system and is validated, as everyone will probably know, once you've got an application reference number, you can go on the planning portal of any local authority and you can monitor the progress of your application going forward. I would suggest that that's important. It would be normal practice that either your project architect or planning consultant or whoever has submitted the application on your behalf, or if indeed it is yourself, that you would want to monitor the progress of your application to ensure that any issues that are being raised in consultation, you have an opportunity to address them quickly and effectively, and hopefully work towards getting a much quicker decision. Generally speaking, most extensions, conversions, single plots would generally be supported and get permission, and they may be granted without conditions, or maybe granted with conditions. Those conditions obviously need to be satisfied before you can actually instigate work, and as a statutory requirement of any planning permission, you're required to submit a notice of initiation of development before you commence development on site. And you're also required laterally, once you've finished that development, to submit a notice of completion. And that's something you can do yourself, or you can ask your agent, project architect, or consultant, planning consultant, to do that for you. But it's a relatively straightforward process. But you need to be aware that it is illegal to start development, well, first of all, without planning, but secondly, without having discharged any conditions that apply to your planning permission, and ultimately having discharged those conditions, you need to serve this notice of initiation and notice of completion. And you can get penalties for not doing that if you avoid it. If you are unlucky enough to get a refusal, most local decisions are normally taken at delegated officer level without going to committee. If you were refused and it was a delegated refusal for a local development, you would then have the option of appealing to the local review body. If an application is a major application, it automatically goes to committee. And if it was refused at committee, you would then have the opportunity of appealing to Scottish ministers through the Directorate of Planning and Environmental Appeals. But generally, most local type developments, whether it be an extension, conversion, single plot, will normally be dealt with under delegated powers, and then any refusal would be at a local review body. Now, in terms of doing an appeal or submitting an appeal, you have basically 3 months from the date of the planning decision to make your submission either to the council or to Scottish ministers on applications that have been to committee. Clearly, you want to avoid getting to a refusal, and therefore early engagement and indeed consistent engagement with officers is really important, so that you can try and influence the way they're going to deal with your application with a view to securing an approval. Sometimes that's not always possible, and you end up with a refusal. If you are, and this is the benefit of actually monitoring applications closely, if you're looking towards a refusal, you may want to speak to a local councillor or local councillors to see if they would support your application, whether that be at a local review body or whether that be at a planning committee, in order to see if, in the event that it was the application was recommended for refusal, if you can get their support in order to overturn that decision. And that can happen quite regularly, but ultimately it's about speaking to the local councillor or councillors to get that support. And it's something that the timing of that is really important. You don't really want to get councillors involved right at the very beginning of a development or at the beginning of a proposal. It would only be in the latter stages where you're potentially facing a refusal, or having got a refusal where you're going to a local review body, that you would want to approach councillors. If there's an issue with personally approaching councillors or your agents doing that, and sometimes there are organisations, for example, Orbit Communications, who will make that engagement on your behalf, and indeed will normally set up a meeting with councillors and also your agents and yourself to discuss your proposal before it goes to the local review body, or on some occasions even before it goes to committee. Once you've got a decision at whether it be a local review body or at committee, the only recourse in the event that you get a refusal would be through a legal challenge through a judicial review, and you would have a 6-week period within which to do that. Now, given that judicial reviews are incredibly expensive and very, very time consuming as well, it would only be in very, very rare circumstances that you would go down that route in the event of getting a dismissal appeal through Scottish ministers or having a dismissal through the local review body. And you would have to be very, very careful about going down that route, because you can't challenge the merits of the decision from a planning point of view. It's more about looking at it legally. So it's whether the decision maker, whether it be the local review body or a reporter appointed by Scottish ministers, in effect misdirected themselves by misapplying policy, that you would have any chance of winning a judicial review. And the other thing, of course, is that putting aside the cost and the time frame, and even if you are successful in securing a positive result at a judicial review, all that happens is that your permission is, the decision by the authority is quashed. It goes back to them to reassess their decision and the rationale behind that decision. And invariably what happens, you end up with having spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and getting a successful legal challenge, you end up with the same decision, because what happens is that the determining authority, in reviewing their decision, simply change the rationale in order for it to be compliant legally, and you end up with the same decision. So you would have to be very, very careful about going down that route, and that would be something that would be rare and something you would have to consider very, very carefully before doing that. And indeed, any consultant acting on your behalf would guard you against going down that route, unless there were very, very good, robust circumstances to support that. So I think really just to finish off, conscious I've been speaking for nearly half an hour now, and just to afford you to ask a number of questions, I would always suggest that in terms of planning, it's important that you do engage early with the planning authority with your proposals, that you do discuss your proposals as thoroughly as possible before you formally make a planning application. And you can do that without going down the pre-application or the formal pre-application route. And that you make sure that in preparing your application, you have got and presented the best possible case in terms of your policy argument and also your design. And if you have given, if you've worked hard on that in preparing your application, that gives it the best chance of success through the system. Of course, there's no guarantee that you'll always get approval. It would be nice to think that we would get approval most of the time, particularly when you're having to pay a fee. But ultimately, I would say that you just want to prepare your application as best you possibly can to give it the best possible chance of success. And I think at that point, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was really helpful, and we've already got a few questions. So I know we've worked together on some pretty complicated planning scenarios, I suppose, and I think always you're exactly right. You're sort of de-risking the process at every step of the way. And I heard a lot of what you're talking about is really understanding what you're going in for. What is the planning context around that? What are some of the other, ecology and other circumstances, conservation that may be affected by the proposal? And there's a lot that can be said about enthusiasm, but there's also planning policy that's backing up a lot of these decisions. So that was really helpful to understand some of that background. We do have a question about timing. So we have probably all heard that the planning authorities are generally sort of behind in a lot of their decisions. So the question is, if a planning authority has effectively 2 months to determine the application, is there anything you can do if no decision is made within this time? Because obviously there is appeal, but you probably don't want to appeal if you don't have to.
So applications, there are three lots of timescales. Three lots of timescales associated with planning applications now. With local development, so for example, extensions, conversions, not involving listed building, and single plots or 2 or 3 plots, they would normally, the planning authority have a 2-month period within which to determine. If it's listed buildings are involved, that's 3 months. And if it's major applications, particularly ones that involve environmental impact assessment, that would be 4 months. Now, there's a misconception that planning authorities must make a determination within 2, 3 or 4 months, depending on the nature of these applications. That's not actually the case. What it is that if at the end of that 2-month period, the planning authority have either A, not made a decision, B, sought an agreement with the applicant to extend that 2-month period to an agreed period in order to make that decision, the applicant and or their agents have the right to exercise a deemed refusal. And what that does is that you're simply saying, right, the planning authority have not made a decision within 2 months. They haven't sought an extension to that. So I'm then going to lodge an appeal, usually to the local review body, for them to determine. Now, one of the downsides of going, well, there's a number of downsides of going down that route. The one positive of going down that route is that you are then taking control of the time frame. So you've decided that we're not waiting on the planning authority and we're just going to go down the route of a deemed refusal appeal. That's the positive side. The negative side is that you are going down a deemed refusal that you may have got an approval on. Secondly, if it was going to be a refusal, you don't know what the reasons for refusal are, albeit you'll eventually find out what they're going to be once you start putting in that local review body and then or making the submission to them. And then the other issue is that it elongates the process. So depending on where, which local review body or the mechanism and indeed protocols that each respective planning authority has in place regarding the frequency of local review bodies, it could add a few more months on to the determination. So it doesn't, although it's putting you in control of the time frame to a degree, it's not necessarily getting a quicker decision. My view on that would be you would only go down a deemed refusal route if you're absolutely clear that you're looking at a refusal. And in fact, there would be a number of instances I would be aware of where applicants and or their agents have lodged a deemed refusal immediately on the expiry date of the 2-month period. But I would say that you would only be wanting to go down that route if you were clear that you could not, you weren't going to secure an approval.
And is there any way to, I don't know if this is as much of an issue in Scotland, but I know in England, we sometimes have trouble even when requesting those extensions of time to get the extension of time, but we don't really have any sense whether it's going to be a refusal, likely to be a refusal, likely to be an approval. It's just lack of communication. Is there any way other than ringing the case officer regularly
Well,
to try and move that forward?
Generally speaking, you wouldn't be seeking an extension. It would be the planning authority that would seek the extension, because you're really wanting to keep the pressure on the planning authority to come to a timious decision. Hopefully a positive one. That's why it's really important to monitor your application once it's gone in, so that you're monitoring progress of what are the outstanding consultees, what have been the comments of the consultees that have responded, so that you can then address those issues and then hopefully, speed up the process. And it is about engagement and engagement with planning officers. Again, the big problem is that there are some planning officers that are really open to engagement. There are other planning officers who are not. There's some planning authorities that are open to engagement. There are some that are not. And it's really about trying to gauge on a project by project basis, because there isn't really any, what I would call, recognised blueprint that runs across the various authorities and officers in Scotland that would say, this is, that we're prepared to engage with you and we'll work with you as we go through. When I was a planning officer, I always made sure of engaging with applicants on a regular basis, because I felt I'm providing a service to the public and that's part of that service. A lot of officers don't think that way. I mean, even trying to get an officer out on a site visit now is much more difficult. And that was very much post-COVID. Before COVID, it was difficult enough at times, but since COVID, planning officers got used to not going out on site and doing all their site visits via Google Earth, which, me personally, I don't think you can get a proper feel on Google Earth. I think it's helpful, but you never actually really get a feel for a proposal until you're standing on the site and you've got that 360 vision of everything that's happening around you. You don't get that same feel with Google Earth. But a lot of planning officers now, a lot of the recommendations that are made are all done without site visits. And you can see that when you go along to planning committees and you see the way things are presented. So again, if you're not, you need to make that early engagement. If you feel you're not getting any response, then you can raise it with, a local councillor and say, I'm not getting a response here. I'm not getting a level of service. Or you could raise it with a principal officer in the planning department, although you've always got to be careful about doing that as well, because you seem to be going over the head of the officer, the case officer is dealing with the application. Or in very extreme circumstances, you can put in a formal complaint to the chief executive to say, I'm trying to engage on my application here. I've paid a planning fee. I understand that the planning officer has got more than just my application. There's a general lack of resources, but can I even just get some sort of feedback? So that's the sort of, it's very much the onus is on you to go to the planning officer as opposed to the planning officer coming to you. There are a number of officers who will keep you up to date with the application. And if there's any issues, we'll ask you, can you respond to this? Can you clarify this? But I would say that particular type of animal is becoming less and less. And ideally, that's what you want, where you've got that engagement with the officer so that you can sort out problems that have been identified early on in the process.
Fantastic. And along those same lines, and the resourcing issues that a lot of the local authorities are having, is there anything that can be done if you've submitted an application and it's 4 weeks later and you still don't have a case officer allocated, so there's actually just no one to engage with? Is that another case of reaching out to the head of planning, to the local councillor?
There's nothing in the legislation that can get them to do something with that application, speed up the process. I mean, I do a lot of work in Northern Ireland, and it's even worse over there. I've submitted applications in Northern Ireland 6 months ago that have been validated, and I still don't have a case officer because they don't have the resources, and they understand the problem. But when you know, the only thing you can do in circumstances like that, if an application's been validated and they haven't appointed a case officer and they're not moving forward, then that may be a circumstance where you would consider going down the deemed refusal route. But you need to be, again, I want to re-emphasize that if you're going down that deemed refusal route, you've got to be very confident in the case that you've got. Otherwise, all you're doing is elongating the process, spending more money and time, and ending up with a refusal. And you want to avoid that.
Absolutely. Okay. So there seems to be a lot of focus on sort of those early stages and the ability to engage. But now I've got a question. It's from someone who says they don't yet have their final design for their house. They've seen a couple of nice designs in other planning approvals in the area. And given that those planning documents are in the public domain, could I just copy one of these as part of the application?
There's nothing stopping you from doing that. I mean, it used to be very, very difficult going way back years and years ago when I got involved in planning. You know, to get access to information on planning applications, there were no planning portals. You had to go into the planning office and you had to ask for what they called the Part 1 register, and hard copies of drawings would be put out in front of you. So there's nothing stopping you from using whatever information is available. I mean, it's like even objections now. I mean, you used to have to go down to the planning authority, get all the drawings out. You weren't even allowed to take photographs. Well, we probably didn't have cameras on phones or anything like that anyway. And you then you took down notes. You then went home, you got your typewriter, you made your objection, you had to go to the post office, put a stamp envelope, send it off. Now you can sit in front of your computer, you can Google any number of developments, you then go into the planning portal and you've got access to everything that's there. So I think you'd have to be careful about copying something and using it as a straight copy, because there would be a certain you could be accused of plagiarism there, but there's nothing stopping you taking these ideas and formulating them into your own development. And indeed, there'd be lots of people who would do that regularly. In fact, there's consultants who would do that regularly, because if you see things that have been acceptable, then, and you know, your client is supportive of the outcome, then why wouldn't you utilize something that's been successful elsewhere? But downloading a copy and then just simply making a few changes on that and then putting it in and then suggesting it's your own, I think that could get you into difficulty. But I'm not 100% on the rules associated with copyright, but I do know that we've all got access to things that are on planning portals. They're in the planning domain, they're in the public domain, and there's no reason why you can't take leads from that and use it to formulate arguments for your own particular proposal.
Yeah, I would say actually, yeah, that's part of the process for us anyway. When we start a project, is to look at what has been approved or refused recently and understand the reasonings why, because it gives you a lot of insight into how that local authority applies their policies. So there's a lot of really important information that comes from that review, and I thought it's part of due diligence in some ways. So, in terms of you sort of touched on objections. How much influence do objections or supporting statements from neighboring neighbours, members of the public who are near the project? How much influence does that have on the final determination?
Well, there are material objections, but they're only material considerations if the objections are predicated on valid planning issues. So you can't, just to simply say, well, I don't like that, or I don't like my neighbour, or I don't like X, Y, and Z. There need to be good planning reasons. So on that basis, objections are taken into account as a material consideration. And if there are strong material planning reasons as to why those objections should be upheld, then there will be. But most developments are determined on whether they're in accordance with planning policy. So it's whether they're in accordance with policies in NPF4 and or local development plan and supplementary guidance. There are other issues though where objectors can strengthen their case by lobbying local councillors to basically lobby to have the application refused, even although there's not necessarily good reasons for it to be refused. And that's where the politics come into it. And I have known instances, it doesn't happen that often, but I have known instances where planning officers have been under pressure where they've wanted to recommend approval, but they've been under local councillor pressure to refuse an application. But generally speaking, applications are determined on whether they're in accordance with the development plan, and that's the whole argument about Section 25 of the Planning Act and the primacy of the development plan. But like everything in planning, it's about the planning balance. So there isn't any policy that says yes for every proposal, in the same way that there isn't any policy that says no. What it normally says, a presumption in favour, a presumption against, and then there's a balancing assessment or judgment to be made as to whether the proposal is acceptable or not. And it's within that balancing judgment where the objections are taken into consideration.
A lot of nuances.
Sorry?
A lot of nuances in the actual application.
It's like, for example, if you take house extensions, or someone building a plot in a back garden somewhere. One of the two of the key issues that come up are loss of daylight and lack of privacy or loss of privacy. Now, these would be staple objections for extensions and backland housing development. Now, you'll know this as an architect. Architects can provide quite clear diagrams that will demonstrate how much daylight will or will not be lost, and also in terms of are able to work out if there's going to be any degree of overlooking, and indeed if there is any degree, what the extent of that degree is. So there are, in circumstances like that, these are valid planning reasons for objecting, but there are ways in which you can counter those objections by clearly demonstrating to the planning authority that these aspects have been exaggerated, because I can demonstrably show that this isn't the case.
Well, that's been really, really useful. I think given the time, we'll wrap up there. I'm just gonna once again share your contact details, if that's okay. So that's up on the screen now. There were actually still a few more questions that were coming in. So some of them were more project specific. So I would encourage anyone who's listening right now, if you've got additional questions, if you have a project that needs some planning support, those are Alan's contact details. And I will just quickly wrap up by going through sort of the top takeaways that I had from Alan's talk today. And that is, first, you want to establish sort of the principle of development, or the allocation of the land for your development. And that can be done via permission in principle, or in some cases, a pre-application. Secondly, be aware of the documentation that is going to be required for your specific project. Project types and project locations can have some influence on that additional documentation that may be required. In Scotland, it's important to remember that there is a notice of initial development that must be submitted, as well as a notice of completion on your project related to specifically to that planning permission. And finally, I'll just touch on refusals. So those can be appealed. However, we do want to avoid appeals. I say this a lot. Planners say it. So if all of us in the industry are saying it, let's take that advice. But the way that can be maybe remedied or de-risked is really by starting those conversations and the research and understanding the planning policy context really early in the project. So I thank you once again, Alan, for joining us this month. And
Can I also just say, yes. I've seen one of the questions regarding Section 75 agreements. Yeah. I mean, if someone wants to contact me directly about that, I'm happy to go through that with them. But Iga's response is correct. It's absolutely spot on that the obligation of a Section 75, or the obligations contained in a Section 75 agreement, go with the land. So whoever it goes with the land, so that you have the landowner at the time the Section 75 is in place. If they then sell the land with the planning permission in the Section 75, that then transfers on to the next owner, and it's therefore their responsibility to address the obligations within that Section 75. It would be very, very. There have been instances where Section 75s have been satisfied, and then they've been passed on with the obligations having been satisfied. But if the obligations have not been satisfied, whoever is purchasing the land would then be liable for those obligations if they were looking to do whatever that Section 75, whatever planning commission that Section 75 was attached to. Okay.
So that's really important.
Iga's response is on the money.
Excellent. Excellent.
Okay.
Great. So that's one more question answered. So perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Alan. Hopefully between last month and this month, everyone sort of feels like they know what they need to know in order to start thinking about their projects relative to planning, and understanding the complexity that surrounds a lot of that planning policy. Yeah. So just as a reminder, there are a few, we will be back next month, but there are a few in-person opportunities to do some more self-build renovation, conversion, extension research coming up. There is one in Swindon at the NSBRC that is taking place tomorrow and Saturday, and that is their May show. So please do come along if you're local to the area, but I appreciate there are probably more people who are Scotland-based this particular month listening to the Self-Build Hour. So for those of you who are Scotland-based, we have at our Scotland office a self-build seminar coming up on the 22nd of May, totally free to attend either one of those events. NSBRC show information on the NSBRC website. Self-build seminar is available on our website, acarchitects.biz. And we look forward to seeing you all again next month. Next month, we will be joined by David Hilton, who is a heating and eco expert at his company HeatNet Energy. And he is, for those of you who aren't familiar with David, he is just a wealth of information about how to tackle low energy heating solutions for your self-built home. So do join us for that. Once again, second Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. via Teams. So we look forward to
one final thing I'd say.
Yeah, first.
Tom Watson was asking if I'm MRTPI. I am, yeah. I wouldn't be where I am if I wasn't, in terms of what I've been doing over the years. Okay.
Yeah. Excellent. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and
Thanks.
thanks
Bye
to
for
everyone who has attended. And please do feel free to go back and watch this online once the recording is posted. See you next month.